And as the panelists find their chairs, I will introduce them to you. Furthest from me is from the United States of America, Judith Garber. And take this, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Did you get that? And next to Ms. Garber is also Larsson-Blind, President of the Saami Council, one of the permanent participants, of course, to the Arctic Council, representing the Saami communities here in Finland, in Norway, Sweden, and Russia. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And many of you will remember from last night, Kimmo Tiilikainen from Finland, of course, Minister for Housing, Energy and the Environment. Thank you very much for letting us be here in your beautiful city of Rovaniemi. And finally, but certainly not least, the Minister of Natural Resources and Development of the Russian Federation, Mr. Dmitry Kobylkin. And Mr. Kobylkin is speaking to us today in Russian. He is being assisted by a translator who will translate everything I say, everything the other panelists say into Russian, and we will make it all work. And when Mr. Kobylkin speaks, the translator will follow, the translation will follow just after Mr. Kobylkin's interventions in the loudspeakers. We will make magic and have the translation come out of the air. And Mr. Kobylkin, Minister Kobylkin, I would like to start with you. You heard the discussion before, so the question remains the same. What can we do to speed up the implementation of all the decisions, all the recommendations already made in the Arctic to conserve biodiversity?
Мне кажется, очень важно, чтобы этим непростым вопросом, который беспокоит большое количество людей, занимались профессионалы.
I think it is important that this issue should be dealt with by the professionals.
Что касается нашей страны, я абсолютно убежден в том, что развитием особо охраняемых природных территорий занимаются беспокойные люди, профессионалы своего дела, которые на самом деле этим занимаются всю свою жизнь.
And as far as Russia is concerned, then it is the passionate people, the champions of this matter that are dealing with the specially protected areas, and that's the business, the matter of all their life.
Это необычные люди. Не всегда то, чем они занимаются, устраивает промышленные компании.
And so these are extraordinary people, and it is not always that the business, the industrial companies are pleased with what they are doing.
Задача государства, власти – найти здесь золотую середину, чем мы и занимаемся.
And it is the task of the state and of the government to maintain balance between the stakeholders. That's what the government is doing.
Главное – слышать друг друга. Главное – слышать друг друга.
It is important to listen and to hear one another.
And if people like those in this room, the scientists, if they want to influence your government to move faster, do more for biodiversity, what is the best way to do that for these people?
На мой взгляд, у нас созданы достаточно большое количество инструментов, чтобы власть слышала людей, слышала тех профессионалов, которые этим занимаются. На мой взгляд, последний указ президента Российской Федерации Владимира Владимировича Путина, майский указ, он очень большой раздел уделил экологии и развитию ООПТ, созданию новых ООПТ на территории России.
And I think in Russia at the moment there's a great number of tools available for the government, for the state to be able to listen to those voices. And there was a presidential decree enacted in May 2018, and there is a large chapter in this decree that is dedicated to the establishment and functioning of the protected areas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's go to the United States. Same question. How do we make sure that politicians follow up on all the recommendations already made on existing knowledge?
I think the Arctic Council actually has a really good track record of implementing its. I think you can hear me, right? It's looking like
No. Oh.
No? Well, then I can get rid of this mic, which is delightful because it's killing me. Can
No.
you hear me now? So I'm not shouting you through the
Let's go
microphone.
to here's a mic.
Can you hear me? All right, we're doing it then. All right, this is much better anyway because this was. Not only was it not working, it was incredibly painful. I had a root canal last week that hurt less than this microphone, so I'm in a good place right now. But to your question, I actually think the Arctic Council has a great track record of implementing the decisions that have been made over the years through its particular structures. I think there's always going to be a certain level of impatience when you have challenges that are affecting people's daily lives, and particularly the Arctic is a place where there's tremendous change happening. But it's also important that they happen in a deliberative way, because that way you're making sure that you're not necessarily rushing to action, but there's due deliberation and consideration that's being given. But I think we've done a pretty good job as an organization of really holding ourselves accountable to what we've been doing, working between our chairmanship structure. We had very close collaboration with Finland as we passed on our chairmanship to Finland. Finland, if I'm not revealing any state secrets, I think has been working very closely with Iceland as Iceland's getting ready to prepare its as well.
So basically, you're satisfied with the speed with which science is turned into recommendations and recommendations being followed upon.
I think science has a very good track record within the Arctic Council. I mean, one of the things that we were extremely proud of during our chairmanship was the signing of a binding Arctic science agreement amongst the Arctic Council. And we're really looking forward, now that that's been ratified, to see how that's going to be implemented. I think the fact that the U.S. has had the chairmanship of CAF in the last cycle, one of the key things that we were hearing today was the importance of science continuing, more monitoring, more evaluation of these steps, and really making sure that this flow continues going forward. Can we do better? Yes, you can always do better. But I don't want the question to be based on an assumption that what we have now isn't working pretty well.
Right, let's jump to the chairmanship, the present chairmanship. Minister Tiilikainen, there is a increased rate of change. The speed with which change happens is growing. The variability we heard earlier on this week is rising. The uncertainties are getting greater. So what should we do to increase our efforts for biodiversity? You've been sort of holding the lead here for a year and a half now. What have you learned in this regard?
Thank you for the question. So I think that we have learned a lot, and we have a lot of information from the science and research available. Of course, we can always say that we need to get more information and more monitoring and follow up and so on and so on. But actually, I think that like we learned this morning that, for example, the area of protected marine areas is not that high at the moment. Was it 5 or 6% of the all marine areas? I think that I wish that we as ministers for environment could give some kind of signal for the next May council meeting that Arctic Council member states could start to work towards marine protected area in Arctic area. It's not in our competence to establish that kind, but we are the countries, we are the states that could give the signal that this is something that we should aim at.
Yes, and let's jump right into it. I know this is a sticky point right now in the negotiations. You're working towards a piece of paper, declaration that you can all agree on in May next year, and you're not yet there. Could you sort of, I know this is secret negotiations, of course, but tell us, what is the disagreement?
It's secret.
You don't have to mention names. Just tell us, what's the crux? What's the difficulty here?
Yeah. So I think that 8 countries with a little bit different interest around the Arctic area. And I know that every member state appreciate biodiversity and respect the value of the nature. But there are different processes in different countries. That we have seen it in international forums so many times that it just takes time to go forward. So I repeat myself that, but I wish that Arctic Council nations can express political willingness to go that direction, so that at one day we will see the marine protected areas. Give a clear signal for that. We are aiming for that. That's my wish.
We wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Let's jump to you, also Larsson-Blind. When we talk protected areas, we talk speed, we talk progress needed, etc. I know that some of the indigenous peoples are afraid that they will not be involved sufficiently, that their knowledge will not be incorporated sufficiently. And basically, you don't have time anymore to fight each other. We need a unified approach to biodiversity if we have to reach the targets already set for 2020 and move on from there. So how do we get past the current difficulties?
Well, if the rights of the indigenous peoples are respected, we would be past that. But I would say that the slogan of the SDGs and the Agenda 2030 is that no one should be left behind. And I think that is tremendously important to have that in mind, that we cannot skip any steps, because then we are leaving someone behind. So we need to do the processes. We cannot skip it. But as you say, the time it's urgent. So when we talk about the protected areas and we talk about the actions going forward, it's not just a concern that the indigenous peoples will not be fully included, because that's kind of the reality in many cases. So, but we have good examples, so we should build on those, and we can build on the Arctic Council, because if we look at the Arctic Council, that is a model where the indigenous peoples have the PPs. We have, so there is kind of a model of not being left behind. So we could use this as a model in other forums to also include indigenous peoples in the discussions, because that is what is needed. It's the full participation and the meaningful participation that is needed.
Thank you. And I think there are very few people in this room that would disagree with anything you just said. And as you said, the Arctic Council is perhaps to many an example of how this relationship can work. So if you were to pinpoint one thing, 2 things perhaps, that should be dealt with immediately, and then we'd be done with the infighting, and we could work together, all of us, to look at the issues and not the things we're sort of not agreeing on.
Well,
what are the 2 main obstacles that have to still be ironed out?
Well, as first I pointed out the full participation and the meaningful participation, but what I think it's a bit too simplistic way of looking at things, because everything is a process. The climate change is not something that happens and then we're done with it. It will keep on. And all the other processes as well is something that it's ongoing, and we will not be done with it. We will be in this. As for indigenous peoples, we have been in our traditional territories, well, for millennia, and we will still be there. So we will be in this process with other land users, with other people. And what we want is to be recognized as one of the peoples in these processes with full participation. So, yeah.
Minister Kobylkin, as you know better than I, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations talks of partnerships as a very important tool, and we've been talking a lot about partnerships over the last days here. We need the youth, we need certainly the indigenous peoples, we need the business corporations involved if we are to solve the problems that are in front of us when it comes to biodiversity, fighting climate change. Can you enlighten us? What would you suggest should happen to strengthen the existing partnerships? And are there new partnerships that must be forged immediately?
Очень важно не забывать историю освоения Арктики.
It is very important not to forget the history of discoveries in Arctica.
Коренные жители Арктики – это истинные хранители Арктики. Это люди, которые живут на этой земле, это их родина.
And the indigenous peoples are indeed the safeguards of the Arctic. These are the peoples that live there, and they safeguard the Arctic.
В периоды промышленного освоения территории на их землю приходили геологи. Геологи приходили первыми.
And as a result of the industrialization, the other people, like geologists, were the first to come to the land where they used to live for millenniums.
Это из истории российской Арктики.
That's the history of the Russian Arctic.
И геологов приютили коренные жители.
And the indigenous peoples, they were kind, and they hosted the geologists.
Они научили их выживать в таких сложных условиях.
And it is the representatives of the indigenous people that taught the geologists to survive in the harsh conditions of the Arctic.
Благодаря им геологи достигли поставленную государством задачу.
And it is thanks to the indigenous people that the geologists did manage to fulfill the goal and to achieve to make the task that they were assigned.
Поэтому мы в неоплатном долгу перед ними.
So we are indebted to the indigenous people.
То, что сегодня добывается на территории России, это огромное количество углеводородного сырья, которым пользуется весь мир.
And a lot of mineral resources, hydrocarbons, are mined in the Russian Arctic. That is something, the wealth that is being used all over the world.
Произошло потому, что коренные жители помогли нам.
And it happened because the indigenous people of the Russian Arctic were giving a helping hand.
Именно поэтому в период промышленного освоения мы не забываем о них.
And that's why during the period of industrialization we do not forget about the indigenous people in Russian Arctic.
Безусловно, существуют проблемы.
Of course, there are certain challenges and issues.
Но очень много зависит от первого лица государства.
But much depends on the first executive in the country.
Наш президент поставил конкретные задачи перед нами.
And the President of Russia has set the specific tasks for us.
И та рождаемость, которая сегодня у коренных жителей, она больше, чем у среднестатистического россиянина.
For example, the birth rate of the indigenous people right now is higher than the average figure for Russia.
Во многих местах Арктики нашей, поэтому это наша особая гордость.
And so that's something we are proud of.
Но проблемы существуют.
But indeed, there are challenges and problems.
And now, we've talked a lot about indigenous knowledge and how to incorporate indigenous interests in the urgent action for marine protected areas, biodiversity, etc. And I keep returning to this question of speed because we have been warned very recently that speed is of essence. So can you imagine ways in which the indigenous peoples could be, let's say, more quickly, more efficiently, more smoothly, more respectfully involved so that we can move on?
Ну, я формировался и работал среди ненцев, коренных жителей Ямало-Ненецкого автономного округа.
I was brought up in a Nenets village in the Yamal-Nenets federal district.
Вот у них как раз торопиться не принято.
And it is not customary for them, for the Nenets, to rush, to be in rush.
Поэтому скорость — это не всегда хорошо, когда нужно включать мозги.
So velocity and speed is not always good. You will have to think first.
Let's take a break. Spasiba, Minister Kobylkin, for that one. Talking of executive heads of state, you have a president that is which is very famous, at least for one decision, that is, of course, in this room, for pulling America out of the Paris Accords. Let's not go into details about that. I just want to hear from you, to what extent should we read that as an obstacle, as a procrastination by the United States on the more, say, pertinent issues that we are discussing here in this room?
Thank you very much for that question, Martin. Yes, the President has stated that the United States will pull out of the Paris Agreement if we can't negotiate better terms for the American people. But what I would also stress is that our national security strategy outlines that the U.S. is going to continue to be a leader on environmental issues, including through the reduction of greenhouse gases. So I want to make that very clear because I think sometimes that's misunderstood. It's as if the United States is anti-environment. The United States is not anti-environment. You asked earlier a question of the Russian minister about partnerships. And I think this came up in the last panel as well, the importance of industry's role as part of those partnerships. And we heard this morning when we were having our earlier dialogues from the Arctic Economic Council standing up and saying that they want to be present, that they want to really be at the beginning, part of our collaborations and more involved in our decisions and the way forward. And I think that can only really be a good thing. And that also works directly with partnerships also talking about local and indigenous knowledge. I talked earlier today with colleagues about innovation, recognizing that so much of innovation is going to be the solution to so many of the challenges that we have, but also recognizing that sometimes what we call innovation may actually be tapping into what has for a long time been traditional and indigenous knowledge, but it's just being brought forward in a new and different way. And those kinds of collaborations are absolutely amazing. I think when you're talking about the speed question that you were asking earlier, the collaborations with universities are so essential, and you touched on that in the panel that was a little bit here earlier. And then I would be remiss if I didn't point out one thing to my Icelandic colleague when he was noticing before the importance of geodiversity. I wouldn't go quite to that point, but one of the things that we're very proud of during our CAF chairmanship, for example, is that we hosted 2 industry roundtables with Sweden and Canada this year to explore opportunities about how to better mainstream biodiversity into the mining sector. So while that's not exactly geodiversity I think that the minister was going for, it does show the interrelationship in certain contexts, and also how you can bring other partners to bear through things like the involvement of industry into how to move this forward in a way that works for growing one's economy while still conserving the environment.
And I want to throw that to the present chairmanship, Minister Tiilikainen. We were reminded earlier in an earlier panel discussion how much of the solution to the climate challenge lies in the Arctic. That the Arctic is not only the problem or where problems occur or are studied, but also that there are processes and areas in the Arctic that are part of the solution and have to be safeguarded and presented to the world like that. Can you enlighten us? What should be done? How can we make sure that the rest of the world understand this part of the equation?
So, in the middle of July, in United Nations, the high-level political forum was arranged, and we arranged the side event on Arctic issues, Arctic Council side event, telling about how Agenda 2030 is implemented in Arctic region. And actually, we may say that the Arctic Council is in many aspects as an example how we have, for example, how indigenous peoples are in the process, in the same negotiations, and we are working together. But in that side event, we also tried to raise the awareness how vulnerable Arctic area is, but also that there are countries that are willing to work to solve the problem. And the same result was in this morning's discussions. So we are not only, Arctic region is not only like a victim of climate change. There are a great number of emissions that are originated from our area, but we have also great knowledge how to reduce emissions. We have huge innovation power if we use that the right way to bring in solutions how to reduce greenhouse gases or how to avoid black carbon to melt our snow and so on and so on. So actually we met with Judith Garber at the same trip to US, and we discussed about the environmental issues, and I met a lot of your colleagues in your administration, both at energy sector and environment sector, and I think that we share the same worry about the Arctic regions, how fragile they are, and especially under Arctic Council, we have all the reasons to continue the cooperation, how we can reduce greenhouse gases, methane, or black carbon emissions within ourselves. So what we can do in the Arctic region to try to do our best to solve this problem.
And I'm sure that a lot of people in this room would agree with what you just said. And we had people sitting on this very stage a few days ago representing the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention, the Ramsar Convention, the Convention on Migratory Species. And I got the very clear impression that even if in this room we may focus on the Arctic and be very preoccupied with things here, that's not the case in the rest of the world. They don't really know what's going on up here. And they don't really care very much because they don't know very much. So how can we change that situation? How can we make sure that the very interesting discussions we have here don't remain in this room?
So, like I started, we should raise the awareness in different international meetings where we are present. But in any case, we have to act ourselves. So we can't wait that someone else from some other corner of the world is coming and solving our problems in Arctic region. We have to work ourselves. But of course, we can tell about the things that we are doing here and encourage, hopefully, others do following our example. If we would go forward in the environmental protection, protecting biodiversity, doing some climate action here, we can tell what we have achieved. That's the way how to raise awareness of Arctic area and its importance to the globe.
Minister Kobylkin, have you any suggestions? How do we make sure that the rest of the world understands the intricacies of climate change and biodiversity in the Arctic and some of the, let's say, the more positive aspects of the Arctic?
Мне кажется, изменение климата скоро почувствуют все. Но это не самое страшное, что почувствуют люди.
I think everyone will feel the effects of the climate change pretty soon, but that's not the worst thing that everyone will feel.
Очень сильно меняется политический климат на планете Земля.
The political climate on the planet is changing real fast now,
Это на сегодня гораздо большая проблема.
and I think it's the worst hazard at the moment.
Мы должны доверять друг другу.
We should trust one another.
Что касается арктических стран, это обязательно для того, чтобы найти общее решение.
And as far as the Arctic nations are concerned, it's a must to find the correct solutions.
Thanks again. Let's not hurry into rash conclusions. Please, Larsson-Blind, it's your turn. How do we make sure that the rest of the world understand what happens up here?
I think it's really important what Minister just said, that the Arctic states and the Arctic region show leadership and show that the urgent situation in the Arctic are that they show leadership in their own, in our own issues, but then it's also the matter of communication. And I think it's not only a matter of communicating it out to the rest of the world. We also have a responsibility and a challenge to communicate it to the Arctic. Because as I see it, first and foremost, the saving or the preservation or that we do in the Arctic is first and foremost for the people of the Arctic and for the Arctic region in itself. But of course it's important that others, because we know about it and understand it, as we know that it influences the rest of the world. But we also do need to step up the communication to the Arctic region, and we heard it from the youth. That is something that we need to do, and I think it's important that Arctic Council also makes these summary for policymakers and communicate the tremendous work that Arctic Council working groups are doing in a language that everyone can understand. And I really appreciate the work that has been done by the working groups in the Arctic Council, translated also the work to Northern Saami, so that we can communicate the work that Arctic Council is doing to the Saami society, because it's key for us also to strengthen the capacity within our societies and to be ready to partner up in the work to be done.
Thank you very much, Ms. Scott.
I just want to build on what Asa said, because I think that's a really important point. But two things. One, first of all, to thank the Finnish chairmanship, because they've been guiding us through our first strategic plan for the Arctic Council. And I think as part of that, we're also looking at strategic communications. So that may answer two of the questions that you've posed to us here today. One, how can we do things faster and speedier? Well, maybe actually having a really credible, collective strategic plan will help us be able to do that. And two, how to communicate about ourselves. Secondly, I fully agree with Asa. During our chairmanship, and I don't mean to look backwards because you've been all about looking forwards with your questions, we realized that most people in the United States did not consider the United States an Arctic nation, because again, we're a very big country, and Alaska is our part of the Arctic. And so we did an internal communication plan there as well, because it wasn't just trying to communicate to our indigenous population in Alaska or other parts of the United States. It was also for all of the United States to understand that connectivity. And that was a really useful exercise for us that made us, I think, all think a little bit more about how we are fully an Arctic nation. But then I'd like to go to a theme that came up in every single panel that we have had today. It hasn't come up here yet, though maybe it did in the last one, I'm jet lagged, which is the importance of communicating science in a language that the average person can understand. And that is so key to the communications here.
Yeah, we heard of a former earlier occasion where somebody had a sign up, signs here for children and ministers. And I think everybody will remember that phrase when they go home, and this is the way that one should, of course, this was meant as a joke.
No, but Martin, I may be guilty as charged.
Which reminds me that there is still, despite the huge amount of science that is being produced, the very great science that is being produced, knowledge gaps has been brought up here repeatedly. And there's knowledge gaps, and knowledge gap is also caused by gaps in funding and infrastructure for science. So, in order to make sure that science produces the results that people like yourselves need for your decision making, of course, these gaps, according to the people in this room and through all the sessions here, these gaps need to be addressed. How do we make sure that the Arctic Council states are cognizant of these needs? I know that you have budgets already, you discuss this all the time, but that somehow this agenda is also progressing. How do we make sure that the funding is always there, that the channels of communications to the governments are kept wide open? I see raised hands and eager faces.
I'll start.
Please.
So they can figure out their answers. But
Oh, sorry. Before you start, could I ask that in answering this question, you also think of perhaps making that your final statement, because we are running out of time, and I know that all the ministers have important meetings, bilateral meetings, etc. afterwards. So I'll ask you to answer this last question and make it also your final remark, please.
okay,
Also
thank you for
Larsson-Blind.
pointing that out. About knowledge gaps. Well, we will never know everything there is to know. There is always going to be knowledge gaps. So that's part of what we have to deal with. But the question is, what are the key knowledge gaps that are keeping us from taking action? So, and I do believe that we have a lot of knowledge already, and I think Minister Tiilikainen commented on this earlier, that in some areas we do have enough knowledge to take action. But then we need to identify where is the knowledge gap that we absolutely do need to bridge before we can take action. But talking about knowledge, I cannot not talk about indigenous knowledge, because when going forward, we need to have it. Whatever action we take, it needs to be based on the best available knowledge. And in that, indigenous knowledge is a key. So we cannot leave that out. And also, we know that indigenous societies are a big part of the Arctic. And our indigenous knowledge is what has been building our societies for millennia. So that's there. And what you referred to earlier about the fight, I'm not sure that it's a fight of if the indigenous knowledge is to be integrated or taken into account. I'm not saying that's the question. It's more a question of how. And for us, it's also a matter of being in the position to develop and bring this knowledge. And for us to be able to do that, we need to strengthen our institutions so that we can foster our experts in our knowledge to bring that, to be the full partners in the processes to come, because we're ready for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Garber.
I would say it's incredibly important that we have robust monitoring programs, that we have good baseline information and continuous monitoring. That's how we're going to be able to approach the knowledge gaps. And it's really important that the products and the work that the Arctic Council does is actually useful to the Arctic member states, useful to local communities, and really be able to make a difference. And for that to happen, we need to make sure that we're also increasing the knowledge from all those partners and bringing that in together, whether it's industry, local communities, and others, so we can really make those synergies happen and make what we're doing absolutely relevant.
Thank you very much. And Minister Kobylkin, please, a comment from you. How do we make sure, to put it short, that the funding is always there, that the ears of the government are always open to the needs of the people in this room and their colleagues?
Мне очень понравилось, что вы сравнили министров с детьми.
I liked you comparing ministers with kids.
Министра может обидеть каждый.
Anyone could harm a minister.
Но в данном случае я согласен. Министры все делают абсолютно искренне.
But on this occasion, I tend to agree with you. Ministers are very sincere in doing everything they do.
Нам очень важно не ошибиться в планировании. В планировании.
It is very important for us not to make any mistakes in planning.
Мы работаем проектно. Мы работаем по проектам.
And we have a project-oriented approach.
А в любом проекте первично, конечно, наука.
And any project starts initially with scientific data.
Когда есть силы и средства, достижима любая цель.
And when there are assets and willpower and resources, then any task could be achieved.
Я надеюсь, что мы все правильно спланировали.
And I think we did the planning correctly on this occasion.
Потому что если нет, то министры будут меняться чаще, чем у вас на сцене сегодня.
And if that's not the case, then the ministers will be changing faster than the change of the panelists on the stage.
Thank you, Minister Kobylkin. And we will leave the last word to our host, Minister Kimmo Tiilikainen.
I need to ask how many minutes we have. How long last words you are willing to hear. So I start with, also said very good that do we really have a knowledge gap that prevent us to act? That is a very good question. We can always say in a scientific meeting like this that there is need to improve the science and the research, and we can describe the needs that we need to monitor more and invest money to this and that. And that's very true. I think we all agree on that, that in Arctic regions there's knowledge gaps. But as a politician, we can't tell to citizens that we don't know enough. That's why we don't act. And I give you a little bit different example. We have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge related to the Baltic Sea, little south from the Arctic area. And our government decided in budget to invest a remarkable sum of money to more effective action to protect Baltic Sea and also internal wetlands, because we have the information. But what happened? Of course, scientists were thinking that part of that money available for further action could come to us so that we can also make some more research. And I do understand this, because but you are asking us as politicians to act quickly because you have delivered the information. And once we decide to act quickly, you say that why you are spending all the money for the action? Why nothing more to research? So we are kids, like, you know, we don't understand complicated issues, but how we can get more information and how we can improve the monitoring with small amount of money. We need to rely on local inhabitants and their observations. I give you another example. We are not running out of time, don't worry. So I'm an enthusiastic bird watcher. And you know, bird watchers, they write down their observations. About 10 years ago, BirdLife Finland opened an internet-based platform where everyone can put his observations. And it's available for everyone. So when you gather observations about the nature and its conditions so that citizens can participate, the amount of information and data is much, much beyond that than any administration can get from official observation stations. So we need this kind of methods to get more information from the biodiversity and nature and conditions, and also to see and monitor the changes in Arctic regions. We need to believe that also ordinary citizens can give reliable observations once they know how to do that, and when we offer a platform to put them visible. So, were there any other questions?
I think that was a fitting finale
Okay, good.
to this discussion, that there's an entire world out there that could provide information, and perhaps that could also be brought into the equation. I think we can leave it there and be safe.
Yeah.
All right. Let's do that. Let's say thank you very much to the 4 panelists and to the previous panel. Thank you so much, Mr. Kobylkin. Thank you very much for traveling and being here. And then I would like to hand the floor to our host here in Finland, Kimmo Tiilikainen. It's all yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, there is one very important piece of information available very soon. I would like to invite the colleague ministers, heads of delegation and permanent participants outside to the front of the building. I would like to give you a gift there, but it's a little bit extraordinary gift. It's I would say circular economy gift. These gifts, bird boxes and insect hotels, have been built during a couple of days here in Rovaniemi. And they are given to you. What are you going to do with them? You are going to sign them. And then you are going to recycle them. We are going to give them forward so that Parks and Wildlife Finland can deliver those signed bird boxes and insect hotels to the Arctic nature to promote biodiversity. And then, hopefully, the monitoring system is arranged that we can get the result. Are there any insects or birds nesting in them? Thank you for this.